The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan mountainside as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez checked his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. His 8-man patrol had been moving through the rocky terrain for 3 hours, and something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this stretch of the Hindu Kush Mountains. "Sarge, we're supposed to meet the convoy at Checkpoint Bravo in 20 minutes, whispered Corporal Jake Williams, his voice barely audible over the wind that whistled through the jagged rocks above them. Rodriguez nodded, scanning the ridgeline through his binoculars. The intelligence briefing had been clear. This was supposed to be a routine patrol to secure the mountain pass before the supply convoy moved through. Nothing more than a standard mission in what was considered a relatively quiet sector. But Rodriguez had been in Afghanistan long enough to know that quiet sectors had a way of turning deadly without warning. Private First Class Danny Chen, the youngest member of their squad at barely 19, shifted nervously behind a boulder. This was only his second month in country, and the weight of his gear seemed to pull at his shoulders with every step. His M4 rifle felt both heavy and inadequate as he watched the older soldiers move with practiced efficiency through the terrain. The patrol consisted of battle-hardened Marines from the 3rd Battalion, most of whom had already completed multiple deployments. Besides Rodriguez, Williams, and Chen, there was Sergeant Tom Bradley, a sniper whose calm demeanor had earned him respect throughout the company. Corporal Mike Santos handled communications, his radio crackling occasionally with static updates from base. Lance Corporals Rick Hayes and Steve Murphy rounded out the team, both explosive ordnance specialists who had seen their share of IED encounters. As they crested a small hill, Rodriguez held up his fist, signaling the patrol to halt. Something had caught his attention. A glint of metal from a distant ridge, barely visible but definitely not natural. He raised his binoculars again, adjusting the focus carefully. "Bradley, take a look at 2 o'clock, about 800 meters out," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. Sergeant Bradley belly-crawled to a better vantage point, his sniper rifle equipped with a high-powered scope. After a few moments of careful observation, his voice came back tense and urgent. "Sarge, we got company. I count at least 12, maybe 15 fighters positioned along that ridge. They've got RPGs and what looks like a DSHK heavy machine gun. This isn't some random patrol. They're dug in and waiting." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. The enemy had chosen their position well. The ridge commanded a perfect view of the valley below, where the supply convoy was scheduled to pass in less than an hour. More importantly, his small patrol was caught in the open with limited cover and no easy escape route. "Santos, get on the horn to base. Tell them we've got eyes on a significant enemy force in prepared positions overlooking Route Tampa. The convoy needs to hold position until we can neutralize this threat." Santos keyed his radio, but instead of the familiar crackle of communication, he was met with dead silence. He adjusted the frequency and tried again, then checked the connections and battery levels. "Sarge, I'm getting nothing. Radio's dead. Could be atmospheric interference, could be jamming, but we're cut off." The situation was rapidly deteriorating from bad to worse. They were outnumbered at least 2 to 1, had no communication with headquarters, and were responsible for preventing an ambush that could destroy an entire convoy of Marines and crucial supplies. Rodriguez gathered his team in the shelter of a rock formation, keeping his voice low as he outlined their options. They could attempt to withdraw and try to reach a position where their radio might work, but that would leave the convoy vulnerable. They could try to engage the enemy force directly, but with such overwhelming odds, it would likely be suicide. "Sir, what about calling in air support?" asked Williams, though even as he said it, he knew the answer. "Can't call what we can't reach, Corporal. Besides, even if we had comms, the nearest KAS is probably 40 minutes out. The convoy will be in the kill zone long before any birds arrive." Private Chen looked between his squad mates, trying to read their faces. The older Marines maintained their composure, but he could see the tension in their eyes. This was the kind of situation that ended with folded flags and tearful families. Sergeant Bradley continued his surveillance of the enemy position, noting details that might prove crucial. The fighters appeared to be experienced, moving with discipline and maintaining proper spacing between their positions. Their weapons were well maintained, and they had established interlocking fields of fire that would devastate any force attempting to move through the valley below. "They're not just setting up for the convoy," Bradley reported. "They've positioned teams to cover the approaches to their main position. If we try to maneuver on them, we'll walk right into a crossfire." Rodriguez studied his map, looking for any tactical advantage they might exploit. The terrain was unforgiving, offering little in the way of concealment or covered approaches. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly, commanding the high ground with multiple escape routes. As if to emphasize their desperate situation, the distant sound of diesel engines began to echo through the mountains. The convoy was beginning its approach, unaware of the trap waiting ahead. Rodriguez knew that in approximately 30 minutes, dozens of his fellow Marines would drive directly into a carefully prepared ambush. The weight of command had never felt heavier as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez realized that 8 Marines with failing equipment and dwindling options were all that stood between their brothers and a potential massacre. The enemy fighters above them continued their preparations, checking weapons and adjusting positions with the confidence of predators waiting for prey. Chen gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. He had joined the Marines to serve his country, but nothing in training had prepared him for this moment, trapped in enemy territory with lives hanging in the balance. Santos continued working on the radio, trying different frequencies and checking every connection, but the device remained stubbornly silent. Without communication, they were completely cut off from support, fighting not just against overwhelming odds, but against time itself. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain clouds building on the horizon. Rodriguez looked up at the darkening sky, wondering if the weather would help or hinder whatever desperate plan they might attempt. As the sound of the approaching convoy grew stronger, echoing off the canyon walls, 8 Marines prepared to face impossible odds with nothing but their training, their weapons, and their unwavering commitment to never leave a fellow Marine behind. The enemy fighters on the ridge made final adjustments to their weapons, their trap nearly complete. In the valley below, an American convoy continued its approach, unaware that its survival now depended on a small group of Marines who refused to accept that all hope was lost. Rodriguez crouched behind the rocky outcrop, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster. The convoy's diesel engines grew louder with each passing minute, and he could now make out individual vehicle sounds, the heavy rumble of MR-APs, the higher pitch of Humvees, and the distinctive whine of supply trucks straining up the mountain grade. 23 minutes until they hit the kill zone, Bradley reported after checking his watch and calculating the convoy's probable speed through the terrain. The enemy fighters had grown bolder, some standing to get better views of their target area. Rodriguez counted at least 18 now, with more possibly hidden in the rocky crevices. The DSAK machine gun crew had test-fired a short burst, the heavy rounds echoing through the mountains like thunder. Private Chen watched the enemy position through his rifle scope, his finger hovering near the trigger. "Sarge, I've got a clear shot on one of the RPG teams. Maybe if we take out their heavy weapons first." "Negative, Chen. The moment we open fire, they'll know exactly where we are, and we'll be fighting from a position with no cover and no escape route. We need a different approach." Rodriguez studied the terrain between their position and the enemy ridge, looking for any tactical advantage. A narrow ravine cut across the mountainside about 400 meters to their left, potentially offering a concealed approach to the enemy's flank. But reaching it would require crossing open ground under the watchful eyes of experienced fighters. Corporal Santos continued his efforts with the radio, now stripping down the unit to check for damaged components. His frustration was evident as he discovered a small piece of shrapnel lodged in the antenna housing, probably from an IED blast 3 days earlier that they had thought caused no damage. "The antenna connection is severed," Santos reported quietly. "Even if I can jury-rig something, we're talking about maybe 5% normal range, and that's if atmospheric conditions are perfect." Lance Corporal Murphy, one of the explosives specialists, had been studying the enemy position with a different perspective. "Sarge, see that rock formation about 200 meters behind their main line? If we could get a demo charge up there, bring down some of that loose rock, it might cause enough confusion for the convoy to punch through. How do you propose we get explosives to a position 200 meters behind an enemy force that outnumbers us 3-1? Rodriguez asked, though he appreciated Murphy thinking outside conventional tactics. "Well, sir, that's where it gets interesting. Hayes and I have been working with some new climbing gear for vertical insertions. If we could reach that ravine, follow it around to the backside of their position." Rodriguez considered the proposal. It was dangerous beyond description, requiring 2 Marines to move undetected through enemy territory, while the rest of the squad created enough of a distraction to mask their movement. The timing would have to be perfect, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. Sergeant Bradley, still maintaining overwatch on the enemy position, suddenly tensed. "Movement on the road below. I can see the lead elements of the convoy. They're about 15 minutes from the kill zone." The urgency of their situation crystallized in that moment. Whatever they were going to do, it had to happen now. Rodriguez made his decision with the kind of calm that came from accepting that survival was less important than mission accomplishment. "Murphy, Hayes, you've got your demo mission. Take everything you can carry and move for that ravine. Bradley, Chen, Williams, we're going to provide the distraction. Santos, keep working on that radio. If you get even 30 seconds of communication, tell base to abort the convoy movement." The 2 explosives specialists quickly gathered their equipment, stuffing their packs with C4, detonators, and climbing gear. The weight would make their movement more difficult, but they would need every ounce of explosive they could carry to bring down enough rock to create effective interference. Rodriguez watched them disappear into the ravine, then turned his attention to the impossible task of keeping 18 enemy fighters occupied without getting his remaining team killed in the process. They had perhaps 10 minutes to create enough noise and confusion to mask Murphy and Hayes' movement. "Bradley, I want you on overwatch. Pick your targets carefully. We're not trying to win this fight, just keep their attention focused on us. Chen, Williams, we're going to move to that position 30 meters to our right. Better angles, and it'll make them think we're trying to flank from the east." Private Chen's hands shook slightly as he checked his ammunition count. 4 magazines plus 1 in the rifle, barely enough for a sustained firefight against overwhelming numbers. But he had trained for this, even if training had never adequately prepared him for the reality of combat. The distant sound of helicopter rotors suddenly echoed off the canyon walls, causing everyone to freeze. Rodriguez strained his ears, trying to determine the source and direction, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once as it bounced between the rock formations. "That's not one of ours," Williams whispered, recognizing the distinctive sound signature. "Sounds like a hip or maybe a hind." The enemy fighters on the ridge had heard it too, and Rodriguez watched through his binoculars as several of them pointed toward the sky, obviously communicating about the aircraft. This changed everything. If the enemy had air support, the convoy wouldn't stand a chance, even if the Marines somehow managed to disrupt the ground ambush. Santos suddenly looked up from his radio work, his face showing the first expression of hope they had seen all day. "Sarge, I'm getting something. Weak signal, lots of static, but something's coming through." Rodriguez grabbed the handset, pressing it tight against his ear as he strained to make out words through the interference. The transmission was broken and filled with static, but he could make out call signs and what sounded like coordinate requests. Through the crackling interference, a voice emerged that made Rodriguez's heart skip. Any station? Any station? This is Reach 77. We are a C-130 conducting a supply drop mission, currently approaching your area of operations. We have observation capabilities and limited offensive options. Please identify yourselves and your situation. Santos worked frantically to boost the signal, connecting spare battery packs to increase transmission power. The radio crackled to life with slightly more clarity as Rodriguez keyed the handset. Reach 77. This is Marine Ground Unit Storm 6. We have eyes on significant enemy force preparing to ambush friendly convoy in Grid Square Delta 742. Enemy has heavy weapons and prepared positions. We are 8 Marines, no communication with higher command, attempting to prevent massacre of convoy elements. The response came back stronger, the pilot's voice professional but urgent. Storm 6, Reach 77. We copy your situation. Be advised, weather is moving in fast from the west. We have limited visibility but can see your general area. Can you mark enemy positions? Rodriguez looked at his remaining smoke grenades, knowing that revealing their exact location would likely draw immediate enemy fire. But with a C-130 overhead, even one conducting a supply mission, they might have options that hadn't existed moments before. The helicopter sound was getting closer, and Bradley reported that the enemy fighters were becoming increasingly agitated, some beginning to break cover to scan the sky. Whatever was happening, the carefully planned ambush was starting to unravel. Murphy's voice suddenly crackled over the short-range radio. Storm 6. Explosive team is in position. We can see the convoy from here. There may be 8 minutes from the kill zone. Whatever we're going to do needs to happen now. Rodriguez weighed his options as the mountain wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall from the darkening sky. Above them, somewhere, was a C-130 with unknown capabilities. Behind enemy lines, 2 of his Marines were prepared to bring down half a mountainside, and approaching from below, an unsuspecting convoy carried dozens of his fellow Marines toward almost certain death. The enemy fighters began moving with increased urgency. Several teams repositioning their weapons toward the sound of approaching aircraft. The carefully planned ambush was becoming chaotic, but chaos could work both ways. All elements Storm 6, Rodriguez transmitted on multiple frequencies. We are committed. Execute on my mark. As rain began to fall steadily across the Afghan mountainside, 8 Marines prepared to attempt the impossible, knowing that failure meant not just their own death, but the destruction of an entire convoy. The rain began falling harder, turning the rocky ground slippery and reducing visibility across the mountainside. Rodriguez could hear the helicopter getting closer, its rotors beating a steady rhythm that seemed to agitate the enemy fighters even more. Several had abandoned their prepared positions to get better views of the sky. Storm 6. This is Reach 77. The C-130 pilot's voice cut through the static with new urgency. We've got eyes on the situation below. That's not one of your helicopters approaching. It's hostile, probably bringing reinforcements. You've got maybe 3 minutes before it arrives. Rodriguez felt his stomach sink. The situation had just gone from desperate to impossible. Not only were they facing overwhelming odds on the ground, but enemy reinforcements were about to arrive by air. The convoy below continued its approach, unaware that they were driving into what would soon become a perfectly coordinated trap. Reach 77, Storm 6. What are your offensive capabilities? Rodriguez asked, though he knew that transport aircraft rarely carried significant weapons. Limited, but we might have options. We're carrying several pallets of equipment for forward operating bases, including some items that weren't originally intended as weapons. Our loadmaster is getting creative back there. Corporal Santos had managed to improve the radio signal enough for clearer communication, though the approaching storm continued to create interference. Through his scope, Sergeant Bradley watched the enemy helicopter approaching from the north, a Soviet-era Mi-8 HIP flying low through the mountain valleys. Sarge, that chopper's loaded for bear, Bradley reported. I can see personnel inside, and it looks like they've mounted weapons on the cabin doors. This is a full combat insertion." Private Chen tried to steady his breathing as he watched the enemy fighters below. Some were now pointing excitedly at the approaching helicopter, while others maintained their focus on the convoy route. The coordination suggested this was a well-planned operation, not just an opportunistic ambush. From their position behind enemy lines, Murphy's voice crackled over the radio. "Storm 6, explosive team. We're seeing movement down here. Looks like they're preparing to receive the helicopter. There's a flat area about 500 meters behind their position that would work as a landing zone." Rodriguez realized that the enemy had planned this operation in multiple phases. First, they would ambush the convoy with prepared positions and heavy weapons. Then the helicopter would deliver fresh fighters to pursue any survivors and secure any captured equipment. It was a textbook operation that would result in the complete destruction of American forces in the area. The C-130's engines grew louder overhead, though the aircraft remained invisible through the cloud cover and rain. Rodriguez could hear the pilot coordinating with his crew, discussing options that seemed to involve significant risk. "Storm 6, we're going to attempt something unconventional," the pilot transmitted. "We're going to make a low pass over the enemy position and see if we can disrupt their operation. Be advised, this aircraft is not designed for combat operations, but desperate times call for creative solutions." Suddenly, the massive shape of the C-130 Hercules broke through the cloud cover, flying incredibly low across the mountainside. The aircraft was so close that Rodriguez could see details of its construction. The 4 turboprop engines roaring at what seemed impossible volume in the confined mountain valley. The effect on the enemy fighters was immediate and dramatic. The massive aircraft, flying barely 200 feet above their positions, created a psychological impact that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Several fighters dove for cover, while others stood transfixed by the sight of the enormous plane passing overhead. But the C-130 wasn't finished. As it passed over the enemy position, the rear cargo door opened and objects began falling from the aircraft. At first, Rodriguez thought it was some kind of bombing run, but then he realized what the loadmaster had done. Heavy equipment pallets were tumbling from the aircraft without parachutes, each weighing several hundred pounds and falling at terminal velocity. The improvised bombardment wasn't accurate in any military sense, but accuracy wasn't the point. Disruption was. The first pallet slammed into the rocky ground 50 meters from the main enemy position, exploding into fragments of metal and scattered equipment. The impact sent shock waves through the ground and created a cloud of dust and debris that reduced visibility to near zero. "Now! Execute! Execute!" Rodriguez shouted into his radio as more pallets crashed around the enemy position. Murphy and Hayes triggered their explosive charges simultaneously, bringing down tons of loose rock from the cliff face above the enemy position. The combination of falling equipment pallets and controlled avalanche created chaos beyond anything the enemy fighters had anticipated. Bradley opened fire with his sniper rifle, targeting the heavy machine gun crew that was struggling to reposition their weapon amid the confusion. His first shot took down the gunner, while his second disabled the weapon itself. Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams began their assault on the enemy's eastern flank, moving quickly through the smoke and dust while the fighters were still recovering from the aerial bombardment. Chen found himself moving with instincts he didn't know he possessed, his rifle tracking targets with deadly precision. The enemy helicopter pilot, seeing the chaos erupting around the landing zone, attempted to abort his approach, but the C-130, making a wide turn through the mountain valley, was coming around for another pass. "Storm 6, reach 7-7. We've got one more trick up our sleeve. Tell your people to take cover." The massive transport aircraft approached the helicopter from an angle, using its superior size and momentum in a maneuver that no pilot should ever attempt. The C-130's wingtip passed within meters of the helicopter's rotor disc, creating turbulence that sent the smaller aircraft spinning out of control. The helicopter crashed into the mountainside in a ball of flame, eliminating the enemy reinforcements and cutting off their escape route. The remaining fighters, caught between falling debris, exploding charges, and advancing Marines, began a disorganized retreat. Santos finally established solid communication with Base, his voice urgent as he transmitted, "Base, Storm 6. Enemy ambush neutralized. Convoy can proceed, but request immediate medical evacuation and additional support for area clearance." The convoy below had stopped at the first sounds of explosions, following proper procedures for potential ambush situations. Now, with the threat eliminated, they began moving again, unaware of how close they had come to complete destruction. Murphy and Hayes emerged from behind the collapsed enemy position, both covered in dust and rock fragments but otherwise unharmed. Their explosive expertise had proven decisive, creating the avalanche that broke the enemy's defensive line at the crucial moment. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the dust and smoke of battle, Rodriguez gathered his squad to assess casualties and secure the area. Remarkably, all 8 Marines had survived the engagement, though several bore minor wounds from rock fragments and ricochets. Private Chen sat on a boulder, staring at his rifle with something approaching amazement. An hour ago, he had been terrified and uncertain. Now he had participated in one of the most unconventional military operations he had ever heard of, helping to save an entire convoy through a combination of courage, creativity, and pure determination. The C-130 made one final pass over the battlefield, the pilot's voice crackling over the radio with professional satisfaction. "Storm 6, reach 7-7. Looks like you've got the situation well in hand down there. That was some of the finest ground-air coordination we've ever been part of. Reach 7-7 returning to base." Sergeant Bradley continued overwatch duties, scanning for any remaining enemy fighters. But the mountainside had fallen silent except for the sound of rain and distant convoy vehicles. The ambush had been completely disrupted, the enemy force scattered or eliminated, and the supply convoy was proceeding safely to its destination. Rodriguez keyed his radio for a final transmission. "All stations, Storm 6. Mission accomplished. 8 Marines, 0 casualties, enemy force neutralized. Sometimes you just have to improvise." As evening approached and the rain began to clear, the 8 Marines of Storm 6 waited for extraction, knowing they had participated in something extraordinary. They had faced impossible odds with failing equipment and limited support, yet through courage, creativity, and the unexpected assistance of a transport aircraft crew willing to risk everything, they had prevented a massacre. The convoy reached its destination safely that evening, its crews never knowing how close they had come to disaster. In the mountains above, 8 Marines had proven that sometimes hope arrives in the most unexpected forms. In this case, as a massive C-130 Hercules slicing low across a rainy Afghan sky, carrying a crew brave enough to turn a transport mission into a combat operation when American lives hung in the balance. The mountain fell quiet as darkness approached, but the story of Storm 6 would be told for years to come, a testament to the Marine Corps motto that no Marine is ever left behind, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources when brave Americans refuse to accept defeat.